The best place to start is with Edward Said, who was a Palestinian American cultural critic. He was born in Jerusalem, then became part of the British Mandate of Palestine, and he moved around a lot growing up. He lived in Cairo, Egypt during a part of his upbringing. Very much a tumultuous upbringing with a lot of frequent upheaval, moving around to different places, never quite being able to settle in to a fixed location. So again, we can talk about how theorists and philosophers in this course, their upbringing, their experience, their life, their lived experiences as outsiders shape their unique perspectives, an outsider's perspective to theorize the various topics we're dealing with, in this case, culture. Said eventually became a professor of literature and a literary critic, and subsequently a founder, one of the founders of the academic field of post-colonial studies. So studies that analyze the historical and the present day conditions of former colonies in the world. And Said used his skills and textual analysis developed as a literary critic to examine the discourses surrounding these former colonies and the power relations those discourses facilitate that are still in effect in these formerly colonized countries who are trying to gain independence, real independence and autonomy and self-sovereignty to this day to some degree, as opposed to just formal lip service independence. Like officially, they're declared to be independent from the empires who colonized them, but Said and post-colonial studies, their goal was to identify the power inequalities that are still in operation in these countries. So post-colonial studies is trying to identify the continuation of colonial notions and practices in formerly officially subjugated, but currently unofficially subjugated countries. And Said also makes very good use of his inspiration from Foucault's framework that we outlined. Just like Butler applied a roughly Foucauldian constructivist and post-structuralist framework to gender to provide a lot of illuminative analysis on gender identity, Said applied similar framework of discourse analysis to cultural representations of the East by the West. And this was consolidated in his well-known and extremely influential book called Orientalism. On this slide, you can see the cover of his book, Orientalism, and you can already start to see what we're going to talk about in how the West, through this painting that's depicted on the cover, is creating certain representations of the East. And we'll discuss in more detail the painting that's on that cover in a few slides. So let's transition from Edward Said, the man himself, to discussing in a more full manner his conceptual framework of Orientalism. What is Orientalism? Well, Orientalism is a body of discourse surrounding the study of or fascination with the Orient specifically. And what is the Orient we're talking about? We're talking about continental Asia, the Middle East, Africa, the global South in general, the have-nots of colonization, the ones who are the targets of colonization as opposed to the facilitators of it. And these have-nots in the game of global affairs are contrasted with the Occident. So the Orient is contrasted with the Occident, which is the West, the imperializing and colonizing powers, the empires of Britain and France and the rest of Europe, and later on the United States. So Orientalist discourse first emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries as a way to facilitate European countries, like I said, Britain and France and other countries like Spain and the Netherlands, their imperialist expansion and colonization of the East. This was a period in history when only select groups of people from Europe, either powerful people with a lot of resources or people authorized in some way to study the Orient, such as academics and scientists and writers and artists, began visiting Eastern countries with some frequency and then returning to their countries, their home countries in Europe, with very distorted representations of the East for all the inhabitants of those countries who didn't have the luxury to travel to the East were made to believe were based in actual fact. And this mass distorted belief of what the East was like made it easier to justify and get authorization for colonizing the East and developing these geographically remote places. So all of the texts, the various mediated texts that facilitated this geopolitical process of colonization were identified by Edward Said in his discourse analysis as belonging to a body of Orientalist discourse. And this includes intellectual and academic and scholarly discourse, and aesthetic discourse, and imaginative discourse, and cultural discourse, and various texts belonging to linguistics and history and biology and cartography and politics and economic theory and novel writing and poetry and painting. They all are used in the service of Orientalism's broadly imperialist goals by shaping our view of the world in a specific, tainted, biased, distorted way. Orientalism is a way of seeing and studying non-white cultures in ways that emphasize and exaggerate the differences between non-white and white cultures. Orientalism often involves seeing and painting Eastern cultures as being exotic and mysterious and culturally backwards and dangerous and wild and something that needs to be tamed and controlled and developed, aka colonized by Western interests. So Orientalist discourse seeks to construct a binary opposition between the civilized West and the contrastingly uncivilized East. And this Orientalist viewpoint seeps down into a whole biased system of knowledge. Like I said in previous weeks when talking about religious discourse or medical discourse, it's not just one book that represents Orientalist thought and practice. It's not like the discourse of Orientalism is shaped and formed by just one single book written by one obviously biased and ignorant and racist Westerner that they wrote about the East. It's a series of books and other writings and depictions from intellectuals and artists and scientists and other Western authority figures in knowledge production who were some of the most highly regarded and respected figures in the West, who at the time no one would have claimed that they were being racist or dehumanizing in any way. So I'll get to many examples of Orientalist texts, but an early example would be the British philosopher John Locke. He was a political theorist operating around the same time as Thomas Hobbes, you'll recall from The Week on Power, who was highly revered in British and European academia in general. And he had the luxury of traveling to the North American continent roughly around the time where it was starting to be colonized. And he studied the indigenous peoples who were there and then came back home to Britain and reported on them in his books and his political treatises. And what did he call these indigenous people in his books? He called them noble savages, which is a bit of a backhanded compliment. He's calling them noble. And that's what we'll see with a lot of Orientalist texts, a lot of backhanded compliments. It's a lot of seemingly appreciation for the exoticness and differentness of the East, but at the same time, subtly instilling notions that they are savages, that they are backwards. And this highly respected authority figure who was like the only one who got to see them for himself through his use of his power in knowledge production, he produced the image of the indigenous person as the noble savage. And that's all that people in Britain had to go on. They just had to believe John Locke and think to themselves, oh dear, Basil, did you hear what John said about the indigenous people? They're all noble savages. And this legitimizes the colonization of indigenous people's land. Figures like John Locke and all sorts of scholars and artists and scientists and political diplomats and traders and explorers were the most trusted authorities and sources of objective knowledge and truth in that society. And they were all writing and painting and conducting research in subtly distorted and Orientalist ways, where it seems like they're genuinely admiring and complimenting Eastern cultures for being so mysterious and exotic. But really, the ideological underpinnings of this discourse is the idea that the East is backwards and must ultimately depend on the West and be exploited by the West. So this is the relationship between knowledge and power at work, because all of this Orientalist discourse that's trying to study and pin down what countries and cultures are all about goes hand in hand with colonialist practices. Very real and concrete colonial initiatives and institutions that are legitimized and justified by that preponderance of tainted, biased knowledge. To give this very irrational process a rationalized basis in order to subjugate Eastern regions in very real ways and put them into unequal power relations with the West. So oftentimes, colonization is undertaken under the guise of something more altruistic, such as humanitarian intervention or development, making it seem on the surface like it's in the best interest of the East to be intervened in by the West and to have their affairs meddled in, thus relinquishing their own autonomy and ability and willingness to self-govern without the West's interference. Like I said in previous weeks, discourse produces us as subjects. And in this case, the Orientalist discourse is producing the Eastern Orientalized subject position. If you fit into the subject position that the Orientalist discourse has made for you, you are made to feel inferior to the Westernized subject and something to be made dependent on the West and controllable by the West and studyable by the West and knowable by the West. So this discourse is creating a new binary between the East and the West, between the Easterner and the Westerner. And like I said, every binary has its own power relations built into it. And in this case, the Westerner, the Westernized subject position, clearly has a superior place in the binary compared to the Eastern subject position, who, like I said, is made to feel inferior through this Orientalist discourse.